Ukraine has a secret weapon up its sleeve in its war against Russia, and it could prove to be an actual game changer. That's the latest prediction from geopolitical expert and strategist Peter Zeihan. With the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, it's becoming increasingly clear that NATO's primary adversary remains Russia. This conflict, which began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was never an isolated event, but rather part of a broader strategy by Russia to secure its borders by expanding its territorial control. From Russia's perspective, occupying strategic areas within NATO's sphere of influence is necessary for national security. However, this aggressive expansionist policy has set the stage for escalating tensions that could extend beyond Ukraine to other parts of Europe, particularly the Baltics, Poland, and Romania. Russia has repeatedly drawn red lines to signal its limits to NATO and the West, but these lines have been crossed multiple times. This fluid approach has made the situation highly unpredictable and dangerous. NATO and its European allies are completely aware of this, and there's a growing consensus, especially in Europe, that Russia's threat must be met with a strong, unified response. Now, even traditionally cautious nations, such as Germany, have stepped up their military support for Ukraine. In an in-depth analysis, geopolitical expert Peter Zeihan reveals Ukraine's secret weapon that could give it a decisive advantage in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Make sure to stick to the end of the video, where we will break down Peter's analysis and explain why Russia's actions in Ukraine will lead to even more conflicts with other nations. Also guys, only a small percentage of my viewers are subscribed. If you enjoy economics, geopolitics, and history, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. Now let's jump in with this analysis with Peter Zeihan.
The only enemy of NATO is Russia, so problem solved there. No, it's we've had a series of red lines that the Russians have established. I think this is the 37th that we've been pushing against one after another. I mean, the core issue here is that for the Russians to feel safe, they have to occupy a lot of territory that gives them a more defensible external perimeter, and a lot of that territory is in NATO. So from the Russian point of view, the Ukraine war was always going to happen, and it was only the next step in a stage of conflicts that will eventually take it to the Baltics and Poland and Romania. There's an understanding, especially in Europe, that this is the situation, and so the red lines are on both sides, and we don't know exactly where the Russians are because they keep making them up. I understand the caution that everybody has and why everyone is concerned about this step in particular. Hitting the Russians directly with Western weapons in Russia, that's not a minor issue. And we only have to be wrong once. But the Putin government has made it very clear of what Russian success looks like. And that steals a lot of backbones across Europe. And I think the fact that it was the Germans that were like the fourth country to sign up for this, and they've been the most cautious country so far, speaks volumes about just where Europe is mentally when it comes to confronting the Russians. If anything, they're being more aggressive than the Americans are now. France is looking at the future of the European Union and realizing that everything is not stacked up the way it has been for the last 70 years. The European Union to this point has been an economic structure, a free trade zone, a common regulatory space, and more recently, a common currency area. But for that to work, you need two things. Number one, you need global access for resources and end markets. And number two, you need a young enough population in Europe in order to produce the goods in the first place. Well, they're losing both of those things. The Americans are sliding back into a more populist, isolationist stance, especially on economic issues, especially under Trump and Biden. And then the populations of countries as varied as Italy and Poland and Germany and Spain are aging so quickly that within the next 10 years, the economic model that we've kind of become accustomed to, with the Germans being the industrial powerhouse, that ends. And so the French know that if Europe is going to have a future, it can't be based on economics. It has to be based on security and politics. And so we're going to need a new structure. And here we are with the Russians directly threatening European coherence and territory. So from the French point of view, there's really no other alternative here. Getting French forces into Ukraine, even if they're nowhere near the front line, makes a lot of sense for staking out the future of Europe and for defending Europe as a whole. And on top of that, I encourage people to think of what's going on in Ukraine a little bit like the Crimean War, the American Civil War, where those were the first two conflicts we had of size, where industrial technologies were part of the contest. Well, drones are serving the same role here. And while the French may have a military that punches above its weight for a country of its size, they have absolutely no experience in drones. So training the Ukrainians in Ukraine on French equipment makes a lot of sense. Having the Ukrainians train French troops on drones also makes a lot of sense. Yeah, officially it's still to be determined. Trainers are definitely a big chunk of it both ways. I would say that the only place where the French might get into a place where they might actually get shot at, and it's very, very low chance, is if they decide to put the French on the northwestern part of Ukraine up against the Belarusian border in order to basically provide a DMZ Korean-style tripwire so that the Russians don't decide to come in from that direction. Let's start by talking about Belgorod. Belgorod is absolutely mission critical for the Russian assault on Ukraine. There's really only two logistical hubs that are near the Ukrainian border. Belgorod is one of them, and it's within artillery range of the Ukrainian border. So that one was always going to be at the top of the list, especially when the Russians tried a renewed Kharkiv offensive in the last several weeks. The other one is, for the future, it's Rostov-on-Don. It's on the other side of the Donbass, and the Ukrainians have very few weapon systems that can strike it in any meaningful way. So that's a discussion for a year from now, 3 years from now, once the Donbass is cleared, if the Donbass is cleared. Other targets within Russia, they're not close. If you're looking for rail junctions or pipeline junctions, they're just not sufficiently close to Ukraine to kind of hit a red light period. Now, that said, there is no way that Ukraine eventually ends this war on something that it would be satisfactory to Ukraine and Europe without taking the war into Russia proper to break those logistical infrastructures. So sooner or later, this will expand beyond the Belgorod axis into a broader sweep of territory. But we're going to go for this whole escalation management, as they like to call it in Washington, where you do it in baby steps. Oftentimes, a single country green lights its weapon system to be used in a simple way. You see how the Russians respond, and then everybody else piles in. That's how it's happened to this point. And to this point, it's prevented the Russians from deciding this is the end. The danger here, the danger since the first day, is that the Russians are in part fighting this war for demographic reasons. Their population is literally dying out. And if they feel that if they don't get to that better exterior crustal defense in the next few years, they'll lose the capacity to do it. They'll lose the capacity to try. And they're right. If we get to the point where the Russians realize that they have completely lost, then and only then are we talking about a meaningful escalation, because it will be the Russians throwing some nukes when they realize that they're already dead.
The European Union has long been focused on economic cooperation, but this strategy is becoming less viable. Europe's population is aging rapidly, and the US is becoming more isolationist, especially regarding economic issues. With that, France sees the writing on the wall. For Europe to survive and thrive, it must prioritize security and political unity. Supporting Ukraine is, therefore, part of a broader strategy to ensure Europe's future. France, despite its strong military, is relatively inexperienced with drones. Training Ukrainian forces on French equipment benefits both nations. Ukraine receives advanced technology, while France gains valuable experience. Looking ahead, Belgorod, a Russian city near the Ukrainian border, is critically important for Russia's military operations. As the conflict continues, Ukraine may need to target deeper into Russian territory to disrupt supply lines and escalate the whole situation. As NATO nations increase their support for Ukraine, the risk of confrontation with Russia grows. NATO must now carefully navigate this delicate situation by balancing support for Ukraine while avoiding actions that could provoke a nuclear response from Russia. Let's get back to Peter Zeihan as he discusses this further.
We are still early in terms of the Russians hitting flight kits to their old Soviet arsenal. They're only using those 2-ton bombs, about 10 or 20 a day. They can sustain that flow rate probably at 5 times that rate if they can get enough flight kits. So from the Russian point of view, it's taking what has proven to be a reasonably successful tactic, just taking these massive Cold War bombs, hitting with a flight kit, and then dropping them wherever they feel that they need to drop them and obliterating everything within a half a kilometer of where the bomb drops. That, to this point, has been the Russians' most successful tactic, but they're limited by the number of flight kits. Look for the Russians and the Chinese to be collaborating on that, and then look to see how NATO responds to the Chinese. Be afraid of retaliation. The Russians do have the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and the Russians do feel that this is their last military conflict. Now, they don't think it's going to end in Ukraine. They think it's going to go all the way to Warsaw. As long as the Russians are holding out a reed of hope that they can win, they're not going to throw nukes. So the trick, the challenge, the balance is to find a way to reinforce the Ukrainians so the Ukrainians can continually make gains without convincing the Russians that it's all going to fall apart. Because at that point, when Russia feels it has nothing to lose, when it's launched a major war, suffered all the pain of a major war, got none of the gains, that's when the Russians might actually get serious about hitting the West. I would suggest that you don't get caught in the minutia of Russian propaganda, because it is entirely designed to get the West to self-deter. And I'm not saying that the risk is zero here. We're talking about a country that thinks it's fighting its last war and that has a few thousand nukes. This is not a small issue. For the Russians, this isn't the first post-Soviet war. It's the 9th. And they're not going to stop until they get everything that they feel they need to have. That doesn't end with Lviv. That ends with Warsaw. The most recent assault was Kharkiv. That was just 4 or 5 weeks ago that it began. The idea was that the Russians would be able to surge forces into a relatively unprotected front before American military support could arrive. And they made some progress at horrendous cost, but now the Ukrainians have sufficient artillery that they've stocked that offensive. If the Russians are to restart an assault that has a meaningful chance of capturing the whole country, they simply need more men. The slow motion mobilization that they've been doing right now has allowed the Russians to maintain their war tempo, and bringing in new weapons like the FABs has given them a degree of firepower that Ukraine simply can't match, but they still need more bodies. We have not yet gotten to the point that the majority of the Russians who are in that core territorial axis from St. Petersburg to Moscow have entered the draft yet. When that happens, you'll know that the Russians are preparing for something very, very big.
So now, let's break down Peter's analysis of the Russia-NATO-Ukraine situation. Russia's strategy of expanding its territory to create a defensible perimeter directly conflicts with NATO's collective security framework. This conflict has seen numerous red lines crossed, revealing an escalating tension building up over time. What makes this situation particularly daunting is the strategic change we're witnessing. Historically, Russia has relied on its capacity to project power and control vast territories. However, the current war in Ukraine appears to be just one step in a broader strategy, potentially setting the stage for further incursions into NATO territories like the Baltics, Poland, and Romania. This persistent and aggressive stance from Russia is currently being met with increasing caution and measured responses from NATO and its allies. With this, it is evident that Ukraine's edge against this war is its increasing support from NATO nations. But as the situation develops, it's important to understand that the conflict could extend beyond Ukraine if the Russians believe their goals are slipping away. In other words, Russia is highly likely to resort to more extreme measures if it perceives an existential threat. One key takeaway from this analysis is that while the current strategies and responses are carefully calculated, the unpredictability of the conflict makes it difficult to forecast. The stakes are indeed high, and the outcome of this conflict will have far-reaching implications for global security. What do you think of these developments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more updates and analysis as we track this critical story.